Hi, I'm Peter Capaldi. I play the Doctor, and you're watching EMS Productions.
Hello everybody and welcome along to today's video, the first in a series of videos over the next few weeks where I'm going to be taking a look back over each series of the Stephen Moffat era as we're coming to the end of it and sort of having a retrospective look back and seeing what worked and what didn't a few years on. But first off, I just want to say apologies for not having a video up in way too long. I've just been really busy with work and everything, not the BBC as of yet, but I've been really busy with work and stuff and I just haven't had the time to get the videos out. And I also just want to say thank you so much for everybody who commented on my video about getting the job at the BBC. I'm just so appreciative of all your sort of nice comments and everything about it. I'm just so excited to actually get to work for the BBC. But now let's get into this video, the video itself, where I'm sort of going to be looking back to start off with obviously at Series 5, the very first series of the Stephen Moffat era back in 2010, all those years ago, just coming off the back of the David Tennant era, David Tennant mania, back into sort of 2007, 8, 9. Then we get to this sort of early 2010 where it's all changed. Series 5 begins. And really Series 5 feels, or sort of the changes of it, feels like a template for what we're likely to get next year with Chris Chibnall coming in, where certainly for Series 5 it was completely new. A new Doctor, new companion, new TARDIS, new writers, new music, new titles, new logo, new everything. And it looks like we're going to get exactly the same sort of thing for Series 11 as well, so this is probably to some degree a good sort of template to look at when we look towards the future as well. And I also think it's probably fair to say that it was time for a change by this stage when we got to sort of 2010 and Series 5. I think Russell, although his era had been very good, extremely popular and probably will be the most popular era of Doctor Who ever, forever, I would have thought. It was sort of, I think, getting to that point where it was almost going a bit sort of fan-fiction-y with some of the stuff that Russell was writing. Certainly stuff, sort of Stolen Earth, Journey's End with Rose and everything, and then The End of Time as well. It was enjoyable, and I think a lot of people did really like it, particularly because it all had David Tennant in it, obviously, but it was probably time for a change at that stage. And obviously bringing in Stephen Moffat as the head writer, he was very much, pretty much always the very clear choice, having been written some of the best episodes of sort of the first 4 series. Every single sort of episode he seemed to pen was just absolutely phenomenal. There wasn't a bad one of the bunch that he did before he started being showrunner. So to some degree there was a bit of pressure on him because he was so sort of highly regarded going into it. So it was always going to be interesting to see when he's actually in charge and what his actual vision for the show would be. And so Series 5 came, and I think it was a really refreshing change for the show to have this. Well, I think Matt Smith was a good sort of change of lead compared to David Tennant as well. He was a little bit more sort of quirky and unusual, I think, than David Tennant, where maybe David Tennant's Doctor had become almost a little bit too human in the way certainly that Russell had written him and that he'd been playing it. Compared to Matt's Doctor, where it did feel like he went a bit more sort of quirky, unusual, weird alien kind of thing, a bit more with Matt's Doctor. And certainly it was kind of an unexpected choice. He was very unknown at the time, but I think he pulled it off very well, and certainly straight from that first episode you very much felt like he was the Doctor. And I think that was just the overriding feeling of a lot of Series 5, was just sort of that it felt fresh. It felt like it was really refreshing the show and starting again in that degree. It had a very different feel to it, where it felt a little bit in sort of the Russell T Davies era. It was maybe a little bit sort of almost soap opera style, with all the sort of family of each of the companions being involved and all this kind of thing, whereas it very much felt, when we got to Series 5, the fairy tale element kind of came into the show. For the first time in New Who, it really felt. When you had all this stuff with young Amelia in the first episode in the 11th hour and the 11th Doctor's first appearing, that was all sort of so brilliantly well done and set up almost the rest of the series, and to some degree the whole of Amy Pond's arc for her character, and that just all kind of set up that very sort of fairy tale little child vibe that we had in that opening episode, which then sort of carried throughout I think a lot of, certainly up to kind of the end of Amy and Rory's time on the show. But with Series 5 it certainly had a very strong opening with the 11th hour. I think it's probably one of the best sort of opening Doctor stories, their introductory stories. It was just really well sort of crafted to really introduce the Doctor, and he was instantly likeable, which I think is a very sort of, can just make the episode feel more enjoyable and more warm compared to maybe Deep Breath, which as much as I really like it, I can kind of see why some people maybe not, because the Peter Capaldi's Doctor isn't easy to warm to in the first episode. He's not sort of suddenly all nice and friendly and happy and everything. He's a bit grumpy and miserable and mean to some degree, compared to sort of the 11th Doctor and Matt Smith, when as soon as he meets that young Amy, or young Amelia, he's sort of being all a little bit stupid and joking around, obviously a bit of the post-regeneration sort of trauma, shall we say, and sort of fun, but he just felt like a sort of fun, easy to warm to and easy to like Doctor straight from the off. And I think that was a good decision, and something I hope we see with Jodie Whittaker's Doctor next year as well. I think it's what's kind of needed when you're going to get a new take on the show with a new showrunner. I think it's generally probably better to give something that it's a little bit more easy to the fans to warm to than sort of maybe Peter Capaldi's Doctor was, just to kind of get the fans into the show a little bit more, I think. You also in the 11th hour had the introduction of the wonderful Amy Pond as well, who was sort of a brilliant feisty companion that we saw. Of course, to some degree, all the companions have been feisty to different levels and all this kind of thing, but it sort of felt a little bit different with Amy. I loved the idea of the whole sort of meeting her when she was a child and then coming back 14 years later, and how that had kind of almost messed up Amy to some degree and completely changed her childhood and her teenage years, always sort of to some degree believing that the Doctor, did he actually come, did he not, sort of thing. And I thought that was a brilliant kind of dynamic setup early on, which then very much sort of played out and had an effect throughout Series 5, really. And the one other probably major thing that was very different to what we'd seen in the Russell T Davies era up to that point was the sort of way that Stephen decided to do the story arcs and the series sort of arcs, plot arcs and this kind of thing. You look at it straight away from 5 minutes into the first episode, we've got the cracks in time and the whole setup, which basically ran through, well, mainly in Series 5, but did go all the way through to the time of Doctor. So basically the whole of Matt Smith's era, it was sort of there, appearing every now and then. And it was set up 5 minutes into his first episode. So it was very much sort of Stephen wanted to put, I think, a little bit more focus on the story arcs. And it's something that I prefer than maybe Russell's, where it was just a random word appearing or a phrase or a picture or something like that, as we saw through certainly the first 3 series that he did, with obviously Bad Wolf being written around everywhere, then Torchwood, then the name Harold Saxon. They were more simplistic arcs compared to what Stephen decided wanted to do with the show, where I think make it all just a little bit more linked and building to something. I think probably this is still his strongest arc, and will be his strongest arc, was his very first. So after this sort of debut episode, when although I was a lot younger, I was only 12 years old when Series 5 aired, I still remember there being a very positive vibe around the show at the time, and certainly looking back when you read about it, you can very much see that it was just a very well received episode, because it was always a bit of an unknown. David Tennant had been such a massive figure for the show that suddenly, to completely change everything, it could have completely collapsed at that point. But it didn't. It was testament to Stephen and to Matt and to Karen and to everybody involved with that they really pulled it off in that first episode and made the show able to run for another, 7-8 years so far. But after the opening episode, we had a couple of sort of standalone episodes with The Beast Below, which isn't great, but I still don't think it's as bad as at least Stephen seems to think. He feels this is basically his worst script, which I wouldn't agree with. It's got some nice thoughts in there. Obviously got Amy saving the day with sort of kindness and everything at the end, which is quite nice. And then Victory of the Daleks, which is average, shall we say. It's a solid, slightly different Dalek story, but still you don't really see Daleks killing anybody, which is kind of standard for most of Moffat Who, really. Then we get to sort of more of the crux of the series, I think, with the Weeping Angels two-parter that we see, where I personally think this might be my favourite of the Weeping Angels stories. I think I prefer this to Blink. I kind of like the whole concept of them suddenly moving and everything. We don't realise initially that everything is the Weeping Angels, and then suddenly they're moving, it's all kind of going fairly wrong, and people are dying and everything, and it's just, I think it's really well crafted. And obviously it gets very arc heavy in the second part, where we have this whole massive crack appearing across the spaceship, and very much sort of setting things up for what's going to happen towards the end of the series with Rory and everything. But it's very well done at this stage to kind of just give us a little hint to what's really going on behind the scenes. The Doctor trying to understand it. Obviously he understands a little bit more than maybe he's letting on at that stage. And Amy sort of, that brilliance, those brilliant scenes in the forest where all those people sort of leave her to go and look at this crack, and then they've never existed again, and Amy having to sort of walk through there on her own without being able to see or anything. It's all very well crafted scenes, I think, in that story. That second part I really, really like. And then those just brilliant little Moffat elements that he sort of brings into the show, where in that second part we have sort of, it seemingly the 11th Doctor disappears, and then he suddenly randomly reappears and sort of has a little moment with Amy, just kind of trying to convince her to carry on and push on. And then of course we find at the end of the series that this is actually from the last episode, and the Doctor sort of having his time in reverse and everything. And I thought that those just little things are the things I really like from Stephen, when he just kind of plays with time a little bit more and just puts sort of flashbacks and little moments sort of linked together. I think that's something that he's really good at, and wasn't something we'd really seen up to that point in the show, because Russell never really delved into that sort of idea. So those little moments are just things I really like from the show. But past that sort of significant mid-series story, I think obviously of course with River Song featuring it as well, all the hints as what's going on with her and everything, with her turning out to kill the Doctor, it's kind of fairly strongly hinted at that point when she says she killed a good man, all this kind of thing. It's like, it's not going to be anybody but the Doctor, but there you go. And the very first sort of setting up of the relationship between the 11th Doctor and River, which went quite far and through quite a few episodes, I think it's fair to say. But then after this we have the kind of, all I can say is average Vampires of Venice. I literally have nothing to say about it. It's just an average mid-series episode where nothing much happens. But then Amy's Choice after that, which I really enjoy. I think it's probably one of my favourite episodes of Series 5, and one of my favourite episodes of the show actually. It's just so brilliantly sort of developed dreams within dreams idea, obviously a little bit Inception style, which is actually released almost at the same time as that episode from what I remember. And yeah, just this sort of concept of Amy kind of having to choose between what she thinks is the real world and not the real world. Both not real, they're both fake worlds and everything, and having this brilliant villain of the Dream Lord based in it as well. It's just a sort of fascinating, well, insight into Amy and how much she loves Rory in the end kind of thing, and how much she'll give up for him. I think that's a very good sort of character development between the two of them. And it's just a very sort of well-crafted plot with these dreams within dreams and all this idea, I think, is really fantastically done. After that you have the Silurian two-parter, which doesn't really do much of anything, to be honest. It's a little bit disappointing because it is obviously a Chris Chibnall penned episode, which he's going to be a showrunner for next year, and this probably wasn't his greatest light. It's just very average, really. So I don't think there's not a bad episode in Series 5, there's just a few average episodes, like this two-parter, like Vampires in Venice, to some degree Victory of the Daleks and the Beast Below as well. There's just a few, it was a consistent series without any real clangers like Sleep No More or something like that, but episodes like this just didn't really do too much more. I mean, it was all about the ending for this two-parter, where obviously Rory's being wiped from existence at the end of it, or having already been set up for 3 or 4 episodes ago, which is just brilliant sort of development of the story arc through the series, really just giving us more hints and clues throughout it, rather than maybe the Russell era, where it very much was just, oh look, there's the word Bad Wolf again, oh look, another mention of Torchwood, oh, Harold Saxon, great. We didn't really learn anything until the finale, rather than actually building through the series, which I think probably Stephen did his best job of in his very first series. It was just so well crafted, slotting bits in. And then obviously the whole bit with Rory dying, looking at how much Amy sort of cares about Rory at this point. Rory, this sets off the start of his multiple deaths, as we all know. And it's just sort of cleverly done, and then obviously gives a better opportunity to kind of build things up to the finale with Rory reappearing and everything. It's just, I think it's just these moments that Stephen introduced into the show that we hadn't seen before are just what makes his era so sort of unique and different. I don't think we'll ever see anything like it again. Following up, there's the absolutely wonderful, sad but beautiful, I guess you could say, hinting Mrs. Schulder, with the Vincent and the Doctor, with Vincent Van Gogh, which is just such a sort of painfully sad but also really heartwarming story at the same time. It's lovely to sort of have that in. As much as I'm not that interested in painting and artists and all this kind of thing, I can still sort of see the appeal of it. And it feels a really kind of a desperately kind of sad episode in the end, of course, of sort of seeing them going to meet Vincent Van Gogh and trying to convince him, showing him what effect his work will have on the world, and him still committing suicide. It's not about the plot. This is a character story. It's very much all about Vincent Van Gogh and that. And it's disappointing to this day that I believe it's Richard Curtis who wrote the episode. Correct me if I'm completely wrong on that, but certainly the guy who wrote it has never written another episode of Doctor Who. That was the only one he ever wrote, and I really wish he'd come back because he did such a good job of writing this story. It's just such a sort of sad ending when you kind of realise that even after what Vincent's seen of how amazing his work is in the future and how much it's sort of heralded, he still goes and kills himself. It's pretty heavy stuff for Doctor Who, really, when it's meant to be a family/kids show that it's all about suicide and depression. It's, yeah, a bit heavy, but it's so perfectly done. Then after that, standard sitcom filler with The Lodger. It's a bit of fun. It's quite an entertaining, enjoyable episode, but it's nothing too serious or significant. It's very much just kind of to fill up the episode 11 slot. It doesn't really have any relevance to the finale or anything. It's just a standalone story. But then it's the finale, and this is still to this day one of my absolute favourite finales. Probably only maybe tipped by the last cut. Series 9 and Series 10 finales are probably the only ones that get close to this one. It's just so brilliantly done, both parts. As much as a lot of people were let down by the second part of The Big Bang, personally I still really enjoy that second part of the story. The whole two-parter just does a brilliant job of bringing everything together from the series, everything related to the cracks, obviously finding out that the TARDIS is blowing up the cracks, why Amy's life makes no sense with not remembering the Daleks and this kind of thing and not knowing what happened to her parents, and all these sort of things, just finally understanding quite what's been going on, bringing Riversong back into it, Rory reappearing, this whole idea of the Pandorica, which has been hinted at throughout the series. The Pandorica will open and silence will fall. Obviously silence is kind of for future series, but certainly the Pandorica opens, that's all being built up to this story. We see lots of other returning characters early on trying to get this painting across. Remember, we get Liz 10, I think we get Vincent at one point, and Winston Churchill, among others from what I remember. And it's just kind of, Stephen loved to sort of pack a huge amount of things into a finale, lots of ideas and concepts and everything. The key point with this one obviously being this whole Pandorica that contains the most feared being in all the universe, which turns out to be the Doctor, which isn't great for him really. But it's brilliantly built up, and then obviously that cliffhanger at the end of the first part is probably one of my favourites that Stephen's done to date, when we suddenly realise, oh no, the Pandorica is for the Doctor. He's trapped inside an impenetrable box. Amy's been shot and killed by Rory, and River's stuck inside an exploding TARDIS. It's all going quite drastically wrong. And then what has now become a signature sort of idea of Stephen Moffat episodes is the second part starts completely differently, somewhere completely different left field of what the first part ended. He's sort of been very much not one for linear two-parters where the next episode continues straight on from where the first episode ended. He did it differently, and it starts straight away with this one in series 5, where obviously you have a young Amy appearing, sort of having a psychiatrist and all this kind of thing. And once we eventually get into the museum, into the Pandorica, suddenly it opens up and boom, Amy's in there, which just, in that moment, makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And it's just like, it's absolute what Stephen does best, sort of completely kind of subverting what your expectations and doing something completely left field and different, and then somehow explaining it later on as well. And I have to admit, I think when I first saw this episode, it took a couple of 2 or 3 watches to quite understand exactly how it had all played out, with the Doctor going back and forward in time, using his vortex meter to switch between places with him and Amy and River and Rory and everything all over the shop. Obviously, episode 2 is much a sort of, to some degree, a smaller scale, with very much only a sort of small cast of the main 4 or 5 characters for the bulk of the episode. It was probably a sort of sign of very much what Stephen's done throughout his era, where his finales, to a large degree, have been very character-focused, rather than the Russells ones, which are usually massive scale, alien invasions, disaster, catastrophe, Daleks destroying everything, all this kind of thing. When you get to Stephen, it's often a much sort of quieter affair, to a large degree, just with a lot sort of more emotion, I think, in what's in the story, with a lot sort of discussion between characters and trying to kind of figure out and understand things with words maybe more than dramatic explosions and action that we saw in the Russell era. And I think that was a nice change up for Stephen to do. It's kind of a bit unexpected, I think, at the time, when you sort of felt Stephen was building up so much. You kind of almost expect, often with his first parts, that he's going to go massive for the second part, and then it goes completely the opposite way. Now I know this video is going on, so I want to get wrapped up fairly quickly. But certainly I think the Big Bang just perfectly concludes the series. Obviously the arc, to some degree, is kind of closed off. The stuff about what caused the cracks, at least, is finished off, and you feel to some degree like that's been sorted out. The stuff with Amy as well has all been sorted, and they're ready to go off on more adventures, as you see at the very end of the episode. But it also still poses the question of who are the Silents and all this kind of thing, which obviously comes through in series 6. And I think it was just very well done by Stephen to kind of have both a single series arc and a multi-series arc kind of all contained within one storyline. It was very much able to kind of finish off bits of it within the first series, and then carry over some parts of the arc to the second series, and that's one of, I think, Stephen's great strengths. So overall, I think very few people would deny that Series 5 is probably still one of the strongest series to date, even with all the series we've had since then. I think it's still probably in my top 3 or 4 favourite series. As I've said before, it's just a very consistent series with lots of high point episodes without any real low points as well. A really, really good arc that sort of was really well inserted into episodes and continues throughout without many major plot holes or anything too odd and unusual and messy. It just seemed to work throughout the series, which I think was really good, and it was almost it was a little bit unexpected of quite what would happen in this series. It was going to be such a different sort of big change to what we'd seen in the Russell era, and it was so good to just see it work so brilliantly. And I think it's hopefully will be a sign of what things to come in series 11, that although we don't really know what to expect from Chris Chibnall whatsoever, I think we can use this series to some degree as optimism for series 11, that they've done it before with a complete reboot, or not reboot, I know I've seen a million comments about it, and it worked. So that's just about it on series 5, which is probably one of the absolute high points in the Moffat era. When we get to series 6, there's some high points, but it gets a little bit more complicated and messy and tricky, and things don't quite go as well as we would have hoped. But I'll come to that hopefully next week, and my plan to try and get these videos out weekly, looking back at each series. But I hope you've enjoyed this one, a sort of look back on Series 5, how it all kind of played out, whether it actually worked as a series. And I think it worked phenomenally as a series, as I've said, with lots of brilliant episodes, like the opening episode, The 11th Hour, with the sort of Angel's two-parter, with Amy's Choice, with Vincent and the Doctor, with the finale. So many brilliant episodes contained all within one series. So do let me know, guys, what you thought, what your sort of thoughts looking back on Series 5 are, what are your favourite episodes of the series, did you think the arc worked as well as I did, and just overall, sort of, yeah, what you thought about Series 5. But other than that, remember to like this video, subscribe if you're new here, and I will see you again very, very soon for another video. Goodbye.